Hello and welcome to Getting Your Money's Worth, the show that focuses on value. I'm Judith West, and our guest today is Christopher Doyle, U.S. history teacher in Farmington, Connecticut, right?
That's correct.
Right. Okay, thanks for being on the show. I think you're a first history teacher we've had, and you do AP, Advanced Placement.
That's correct, yeah.
Tell me something. I majored in history. I taught history even. But when I taught history, I don't want to give away anything. We had these New York Times little supplements that came out, weekly supplements, and we read them. And it was like a piece of current events. Do you do that anymore?
They don't do that anymore, not in AP classes.
And AP is too high for current events.
I wouldn't say it's too high for current events. The problem is that current events do not figure in the AP exam, and that's a national exam. The College Board, the company that makes SATs, puts out the AP exam.
Right.
They are supposedly modifying the test, so 2 years from now there will be some current events. But unfortunately for many teachers, most teachers, and over 1 million students every year, AP can come across as kind of a march through time.
AP is Advanced Placement.
Advanced Placement, right.
Okay. What about the general course level? I mean, there's a general feeling here with many people who speak out that, but forget AP, that in general across the board, kids graduate without too much knowledge of the history of this country.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's ironic, and AP can actually encourage that to an extent because there is so much material potentially on the test that you can't spend too much time on any singular subject, and that makes it hard to generate enthusiasm for history.
Yeah, well, that opens up the whole area of testing. But let's just talk about teaching history. Is history taught in the elementary schools?
Yes, it is. Yeah. In our state, there's colonial America is usually taught in 4th grade. In 8th grade, they generally teach 19th century America, and we actually do the entire sweep of America history from the colonial period through the 1980s.
So what do kids learn? Do they learn a love of the country? Do they learn that history could predict the future, or do they just learn a bunch of battles and dates and who was president when and blah blah blah?
That's a great question. They tend to get the same stories time and again, and they tend to be stories that reinforce a conventional kind of patriotism.
Such as, give me an example.
They get the story of the Pilgrims time and again. They get the story of the first Thanksgiving. They get the story of how the Civil War liberated slaves. They don't get some of the messier stories in American history yet. They didn't know anything about the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II.
Is that deliberate?
I don't know if the people who design the curriculum feel that calls for a sophistication, the ability to understand both good and bad as part of the American story. So I can't really say that's deliberate.
Right. So it's clear. But what is the goal of teaching history, Christopher? You think about this. You do this for a living. Forget the AP, but what is the goal of teaching history?
I think history is fundamentally a humanity rather than a science or a social science. You want your students to develop empathy for people who lived before them on a feeling level, and you want them to feel enthusiasm for the subject. It also involves complexity. Just like you or I as individuals, we're not all going in one direction.
Exactly.
We have conflicting impulses. Nations do too.
Right, exactly. And especially now, many of your students that you have under your wing now live through wars.
They have. And when I teach about the 2 current wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, my students, when 9/11 happened, were in 2nd grade. And they see the war on terrorism as kind of the backdrop to their lives.
Right.
And after a while, they stop paying attention to it. It's like background noise. They've actually used that expression to describe their thinking about these wars before I teach them. It's been a kind of soundtrack of background noise that they've forgotten about.
So what is your goal? Is your goal then to make them feel it more, to be more personally involved, to think through things like, the negotiations in the Middle East? What is it your goal? All of that.
I think
how do you do that? How do you open up somebody's heart and pour that in?
I think we're at a point now where we can teach some parts of these wars as history. And like any event in history, we have to study cause and motive and the psyches of individual leaders and participants. And then we have to understand there's going to be different interpretations of these events. So my goal is to kind of mess with my students' minds. I'm not going to tell them a straightforward story. I'm going to give them lots of different sources, none of which they've read or studied before. I'm going to have guest speakers come in who've been in these wars and can talk about things like post-traumatic stress disorder, building schools in Afghanistan, what it felt like to be a Navy medic in the first wave of troops into Iraq. And then I'm going to let them come up with larger meanings. That's what my job is. I have to teach my students to put all this disparate information together into a larger picture that makes sense, that's inclusive, and that's comprehensive.
Right. As part of all this teaching and we hope is learning, do kids come out of this with a sense of how important all this history is to where they are today?
I think the most compelling thing that my students get from this is that real life people, flesh and blood people, who I've brought into the classroom, are actually caught up in this. Right. And that we as a nation are caught up on this.
So does it open up a tolerance?
I don't know what you mean by that, by tolerance.
A tolerance for, all peoples. Does it open? Is it a way?
No, usually students come out with pretty impassioned points of view on this, and they're all over the board. They're all over the spectrum. And so they get kind of hot about it.
Yeah.
This show's title is worth considering, too, in the context of what I do. Afghanistan right now is costing us $10 billion a month.
Right, exactly.
And, some of my students get upset about that when they hear about that.
Especially if they're living in an area or where they see things failing in their own country.
Right, that's exactly right.
If they have an unemployed person in their family, as many of us do these days.
Our state in Connecticut is broke.
Your state in Connecticut is broke. We just have that. Right, exactly. Money is coming out of education like crazy and going to defense.
Right.
Right. So listen, adults worry about it. So I suppose opening up the minds of kids to worry about it. If you're doing that, it's an amazing job, Chris, because these kids, we hope, some of them might be our future legislators.
I'd like to think that one of my students would be, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure you would. In general, though, you're speaking for yourself. I have the sense, though, that your goals are not as broad-based across the board nationally.
I have a moment of opportunity. When our AP exam is over, I still have 6 weeks of school. And I have a window then when I can experiment and do what I want. And I came into this topic because back in about 2005, I started to ask some questions about Iraq and Afghanistan. And I realized that my students couldn't tell you the difference between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. Right. They couldn't tell you any of the countries that Iraq or Afghanistan border. Both share a border with Iran, and none of my students could tell you that. So I kind of got a sense that on a certain basic level of civics education, we were failing these kids. Textbooks are going to write about these two wars as a defining experience for their generation. Right. They know virtually nothing about them. They will
be for this generation what World War II was for preceding generations.
That's correct. Or the Cold War.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I just lost my train of thought. There was something I wanted to say about the ability to teach civics. Civics and history, are they that different?
I think they are, and I think it has to do with method. I feel much more comfortable as a historian, and to be honest, I think like most historians, we feel most comfortable analyzing people who died a long time ago.
Right.
I start this unit of study with an excerpt from a play called The History Boys. And a very wise teacher in The History Boys points out that there is no period so remote as the recent past. We don't have the space or the time to detach ourselves and look back on the recent past. Lives are still ongoing who know this history. I think one of the major goals of history is this detached analysis. that we often can't do in civics because we're too caught up in the moment.
Aren't you supposed to learn from history? I mean, isn't one of the points of studying history is that the failures of the past aren't repeated in the future?
Yeah, the philosopher George Santayana started that
Right.
quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
I'm a little bothered by that, and I'm a little bothered by that because that assumes that the past is kind of a fixed series of events replaying themselves all the time. In fact, I would say that the past is endless variety. I think we can learn from the past, but I think it's a lot more complicated to do that than most people are willing to consider.
Well, I suppose we took our own past right now. I mean, look, we had things happen in this country in the past 4 or 5 years that have never happened before, including financial, and you know, there's not a whole lot of change on the horizon. It seems that the same kinds of possible debacles still exist.
Right, right. Well, you know, another way of thinking about it is if you think about an individual thinking about her childhood, you know, there are things consciously that you remember from your childhood and other things that you don't. I think history is a little bit like psychology in that sense, in that nations, just like people, have kind of subconscious memories. Maybe a good historian can bring some of those to light.
Right, exactly.
Like a good therapist can.
It's like I say, yeah, I mean, history, I suppose, can be a form of therapy.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, that's well said.
If you think about that, yeah. Well, what's the demography of your kids?
Farmington where I teach, is a middle to upper middle class suburb of Hartford. Now that said, we do have students, about 150 in a school of 1,300, who are bused in from inner city Hartford. And we also have pockets of less than affluent students within Farmington.
Right, and I would think these kinds of experiences, I mean, I know you're AP, but I would think these kind of experiences would be very worthwhile on a very generalized basis.
Yeah, you know, most of my students are not considering careers in the military.
Right.
If I were teaching, I don't know, rural Colorado,
you might find a difference.
Right.
But even so, within there, I think it's good to know there is the military and there's the military.
Right. And I've had officers come in, former officers who have Ivy League college in their background, and I've had enlisted people come in who've signed up right out of high school to talk to my students about being in Iraq or Afghanistan.
Right, yeah. Well, I was very titillated by reading about you in the paper, and I'm very happy to have you on as a guest. And yes, I hadn't thought about it before. We ought to really connect history and what it costs us with getting your money's worth. It's a very good connection.
Thank you.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks.
I'm Judith West. You're watching Getting Your Money's Worth. Our guest was Chris Doyle, an amazing AP Advanced Placement teacher of history in Farmington, Connecticut. Thanks for watching.